For over 36 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and today we'll examine the military situation. I'm Julian Rupka with BILD Situation Room, and we begin in the western Russian region of Kursk. There, what had been anticipated over the past few days has now come to pass. Russia has likely regained control of the region by 99 to even 100% entirely. We are seeing videos from the Russian army that have been released since yesterday. They primarily depict the raising of flags in the last roughly 10 to 15 villages that had remained under Ukrainian control until recently. As we know, since last weekend, Russia has advanced extremely far here, in some cases up to 10 kilometers a day, steadily advancing and capturing more of the remaining nearly 30 settlements that Ukraine had under its control. We know there were various factors for this. On one hand, there was this pipeline operation where the Russians crawled underground 10 kilometers behind the Ukrainian lines. Over weeks, they gradually made their way through there, but of course also the mounting pressure from all sides as well. The North Koreans were deployed here, partially cut off the connection and disrupted the logistics. But also the lack of information and in part ammunition from the USA. All of this combined has led to Ukraine here after over 7 months having to retreat significantly. And now it's exactly 7 months and 6 days since August 6th, 2024, when this Ukrainian surprise attack began. And we now have the situation where all or nearly all, maybe even all the places that were still under Ukrainian control are now back under secure control. These images are from yesterday. They show us Sudzha, the center, and we see Ukrainian soldiers during their retreat. These are dozens of soldiers retreating on foot. Numerous cars and vehicles have been utterly destroyed. So we're seeing here again from further away, this was the center of Sudzha. That was still under Ukrainian control yesterday. This morning, we're now seeing footage from the central square in front of the cultural center in Sudzha. The Russian army has returned. The entire Kherson region, including the last town with 6,500 residents, is back under their control. Under Russian control. We're taking a look at the situation on the map, though we don't have the absolute latest update yet. The map provider is running a bit behind, but we still have this comparison available to show how things looked 8 days ago, or 9 days ago on March 3rd. Back then, it looked like this. We had about 450 square kilometers of Kursk under Ukrainian control. Now let's switch to yesterday afternoon. That was the situation back then. We can see that the area has significantly shrunk. As I already mentioned, on one side we have there's a North Korean push in this direction, while the Russians have crossed the border at Svetlikovo and are advancing toward the supply route, which we can see here clearly marked, have advanced towards the supply route. And we had a parallel situation where there was significant pressure both from the direction of Malaya Loknia, which fell on Sunday, as well as from the direction of Matinovka. From all sides, there was an advance towards Suka, attempting to take control of the town. And the Ukrainians apparently managed at the very last moment to successfully pull out the majority of their soldiers. We can clearly see it was by no means an easy task. Let's go ahead and mark it. These are the 12 kilometers we're observing here. That means the Ukrainers had to endure an incredibly grueling march of roughly 13 to 14 kilometers to make it back from Sudzha to the border. However, they seem to have succeeded for the most part. At least as of today, we haven't received any information about large accumulations of prisoners of war on the Ukrainian side. And also, this is equally important, no reports of encircled Ukrainian troops. That means they managed to pull it off successfully. I can mark it in red. That was the critical road, and they held it until the very last moment to break out from Kostka and withdraw towards the direction of Sumy, towards the Sumy region. And many are naturally asking now, did it all serve any purpose? Did those 7 months make a difference? I would definitely say yes. We've seen that more than 500 Russian tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed. Ukraine claims to have killed 20,000 Russian soldiers in this operation in Kursk. I think the reality is probably around half of that if you look at the numbers over the past few months. But nonetheless, as I said, 10,000 fewer Russians advancing in Donbas, and of course also more than 1,000 North Korean troops, according to various reports and statements made. Also according to statements from the South Korean intelligence here in Kursk, have fallen. In other words, the whole thing was already an operation that ensured the rules of this war here were fundamentally altered, were transformed, that for the first time in 2.5 years of war, intense fighting erupted on Russian soil last summer. And of course, this whole situation had the effect that Vladimir Putin had to make it very clear to his population, or at least admit, that it's not just a special military operation, a major war now unfolding on our soil where, as we've just witnessed, even Russian cities are being devastated in the process. And that, in a way, Zrania is, at least from the strategic perspective of Ukraine, a success that has been achieved. We're traveling from Kursk to Donetsk in the Donbas, where we're examining the latest footage of the ongoing battle around Pokrovsk. First up, We have new recordings from Shevchenko, a suburb that's been the scene of intense fighting recently, where the Russians are trying to push forward. This is one of the last suburbs of Pokrovsk. We actually have a large city that's surrounded by many suburbs, but also here the last suburb before the city begins. And we see how hellish the situation here is for the Russian soldiers. We see that these ruins of this small town are being bombarded by drones, being bombarded very precisely by drones. And we see the Russians now coming out of the basements, some of them clearly traumatized and already injured, but they're still moving, at least. And we can see how every single hole, every single basement, every single roof that still exists is being precisely targeted by the Ukrainians. Everywhere it's assumed that behind them are Russian soldiers and that in these ruins, Russian soldiers are hiding. And that is precisely a reason why, as we've repeatedly said over the past months, it's been months now, one can quite clearly say that the Russians are currently not making progress toward Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk remains the third largest city in the region under Ukrainian control. The two largest are Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. In those areas, the attack has nearly been entirely abandoned. They are no longer advancing on it at all. Instead, their primary focus now is on gaining control over Pokrovsk. The whole thing isn't working at all. We can clearly see the reasons here. This entire area has become an absolute death zone for the Russian army in the outskirts of Pokrovsk, being precisely targeted by hundreds of drones every day, attacked by Ukraine, and being significantly diminished here. And this decimation of the soldiers is part of what Ukraine is doing. The second part is targeting the vehicles, the logistics, the entire supply chain near Pokrovsk. And here we have a new video of Russian soldiers, and this video shows us one of these roads of death, these death roads leading toward Pokrovsk. We can see it's a relatively small road. I hope you can make that out. It was essentially just a single lane path. On the left and right, you can see the trees here, but we also spot destroyed vehicles scattered everywhere around us. We can just walk through and see that these are no longer tanks and armored personnel carriers, but for the most part, these are civilian vehicles that Russia has used here, attempted to utilize, and which were completely destroyed by precision kamikaze drones operated by the Ukrainian army on this narrow road. So we start with this Desert Cross 1003 from China here on the right side, and then on the left, loaders time and time again. These are repeatedly just regular civilian vehicles that the Russians have used to operate in this absolute death zone under Ukrainian mortars, under artillery, under kamikaze drone threats. To push forward something that I believe any normal army in the world would categorically rule out for itself under such brutally deadly and extreme battlefield conditions. We see it here again and again. These are very simple loaders, civilian vehicles without any armor. Advancing under these murderous conditions, it obviously doesn't matter to the Russian military leadership, to the Russian dictator. He is willing to lose hundreds of thousands of soldiers, even if just one more place can be captured in ruins. So every now and then, we spot a single Ural truck, and then again, civilian vehicles without any form of armor that we can see all along this entire stretch of the road up here ahead. And so, in the end, we see the situation is that there's no traffic at all left on the road. We also have in the middle the truck which couldn't be towed away, but the Russians have to move the last few kilometers to Pokrovsk on foot, and that of course is an extremely difficult and dangerous situation for them. We just saw it, the Ukrainian drones are patiently waiting for every single Russian soldier. Let's take a closer look at the situation on the map. We just saw the footage from Shevchenko on one side, and now we'll examine the broader context of the area. And Shevchenko we see is not yet blue. That means the Ukrainians haven't managed to return here. But we can see this large orange area, which also covers the entire north of Shevchenko, includes. The Ukrainians have not managed to retake the town, the small town, but the Russians are also not making progress and are no longer able to. One would practically be, if you had been north of Shevchenko, you would have only had, we can take a look, it's about 2-3 kilometers. That would have been the distance to Pokrovsk, but the Ukrainians have at least currently managed to prevent that. We don't know what will happen if, though it doesn't seem likely, but if US weapons stop coming or something similar, we're unsure. For now, it's like this. The Ukrainian counteroffensive in Shevchenko hasn't led to liberation yet, but has triggered intense heavy combat. We have the situation in Lysivka, Peshane, Kotlin, and Uspenivka, where the Russians had to withdraw because of the situation we just observed. And we don't know exactly where the road is that we just saw. However, we assume it's a small road, not one of the main roads, leading from Zelidovi Komen towards the front. One of many side roads the Russians try to use as an alternative. And this road, as we just saw, is a road of death. A death road and a death zone for the Russians, not just for the soldiers, but also for their vehicles. A bit further north, we're staying in the Donbas region near Siversk. The Russian army has once again managed to gather tanks and armored vehicles for a large-scale assault on Siversk, on a suburb of Siversk, and we're taking a look at the footage of it. Here we see Ukrainian recordings of this large-scale attack involving a total of 16 tanks and armored vehicles of the Russian army. That many were deployed for this single attack. This means they've once again succeeded in concentrating and deploying mechanized forces to mass and concentrate. But we see how the Ukrainians are fighting back. We can already spot individual artillery rounds hitting, and now we're seeing it directly down here. This is very typical. Cluster munitions are being used against the infantry that's dismounting from the destroyed vehicles. Let's take a closer look at the video and see that even where the Russians are able to, in this case 16 armored personnel carriers, all with those sheds on top, it's all extremely overbuilt and packed together, even there, they're no longer able to break through, at least not along this Donbas front. We're seeing the vehicles getting destroyed. Here you can see quite clearly how packed they always are. That means the vehicle is now burning here, it's not going any further. Identifying tanks versus armored vehicles is now extremely challenging, as seen here, because they're so heavily built over with these large protective cages. Nevertheless, the soldiers are now disembarking here and will be engaged individually. We've cut out a lot there because, of course, you can also see how the soldiers of the Russian army are killed following the vehicles. In total, 16 vehicles were deployed, 14 were completely destroyed, and 2 managed to retreat. And consequently, as we can see, that was roughly 8 soldiers per vehicle that were deployed. So an attack involving approximately 100 soldiers, and in the footage we can clearly see that many of them are losing their lives. We know that Siversk, which we'll look at on the map in a moment, remains under Ukrainian control, and so the whole attack failed. Here's a quick look at a recording. It's always a bit tricky to accurately gauge just how many deployed vehicles are actually descending here all at once, how they're steadily advancing toward the Ukrainians. Some people just claim it's propaganda. There aren't 16, it's only 2 or 3. But when you look at the whole thing in mass and you also see how the cuts are, where exactly the tanks are clearing the way, we're actually in a position to pinpoint that on the map, then you can really see it's a very large number from vehicles deployed in a single day or within several hours, which ultimately led to, or the entire attack resulted in, likely between 50 and 100 dead Russian soldiers and the loss of 16 additional vehicles, significantly impacting their operational capabilities. Here we can see the attempts to evacuate following the situation. Sometimes there's still evacuation going on, like there's this vehicle that's been left lying there, which is an armored personnel carrier, and it's practically being nudged by this smaller vehicle. Again, that seems like a civilian vehicle, unclear if it's a Lada or Desert Cross. Definitely something very, very small. They're trying to stop wounded soldiers who got stuck here during this mechanized attack. But we also see it. This attempted evacuation of the wounded ultimately ends in complete disaster, resulting in the tragic death of nearly all the soldiers involved there. We're looking at the whole thing on the map. Let's see where Siversk is. It's also a former relatively large city that, unfortunately, was completely shattered in recent years. There are hardly any people left there. Siversk is right here at the front, near the Luhansk region, but still in Donetsk. And we can see right next to it that would be Slavyansk, about 20 kilometers further west. Slavyansk has 200,000 people, about half still there. The Russians are supposed to attack this major city, but they can't do it right now. In between is Siversk, and we can also see this attack has just been thwarted. Now we've just seen the Russians attempted to establish at least some kind of rescue chain during a large mechanized attack. That means they at least attempted, using small vehicles, which also didn't go well, to evacuate those large vehicles or the injured soldiers from the area. That is, one must say, at least something. In mechanized attacks, in infantry assaults, we very often have the situation where there is no rescue chain at all, no possibility whatsoever. And the soldiers are well aware of it, no evacuation, so anyone who gets wounded will die there as well. And to prevent that, to avoid the slow, agonizing death following an injury, we're increasingly witnessing situations where Russian soldiers decide to take their own lives. That Russians also ask their comrades to end their lives quickly so they don't lie there for hours or days before they die. And now we're going to look at such a situation, so consider yourself warned. We've, of course, heavily pixelated everything. Nonetheless, this is the reality of the Russian army in the Donbas. Here we see lately, we've increasingly observed a small squad of just 2 soldiers moving from point A to point B, so it means they've once again found 2 guys to replace some position where likely others were killed. Right now, we're witnessing an explosion, most likely caused by kamikaze drones, though we can't be entirely certain. At this moment, we're observing 2 soldiers. One of them is fully pixelated. That's the wounded individual. Even if pixelated on purpose, you can see he's bleeding from the leg. That means he can't go any further. It might even be a critical bleed, which means he's losing so much blood that he would essentially need medical attention. In an emergency, if it's not the case, he would die here. We see that his comrade is still trying to take care of him. He's making an attempt, likely using a tourniquet or something similar to stop the bleeding. But it doesn't work, and of course we truly have no clear idea what the 2 of them said to each other. But we know what happens next. The one on the ground, still conscious as seen, has said something to him. The other soldier steps over, grabs his rifle, and fatally shoots his wounded comrade, who is now critically injured and completely incapable of continuing to move forward. The whole thing is pretty terrible scenes. And you can also tell from the shots, we don't see it clearly here because we've obviously pixelated it, that it's only the third or fourth shot that hits the comrade. That means even from just a meter away, there's likely a lot of intense emotion for the soldiers involved. We've seen that the first shots missed, hitting the sand instead. And after that, he hits his comrade's head, who consequently dies. And the soldier, the survivor just keeps moving. That's the reality of war, of Russia's war. That's the alternative to the rescue chain, because you know it's a one-way ticket. And that's what the Ukrainians say as well. The Russians know they're moving forward. Either they make it or they die, and that's simply the situation many of them are suffering under. We saw it during mechanized attacks with numerous tank gunners and large armored units involved. There, at least, attempts are occasionally made for an evacuation. With small attacks or minor relocations like these two soldiers, it's sometimes the case that you don't even try anymore to save the wounded. We want to go back to February, a video from a few weeks ago, which has only just been released now. We have new recordings that demonstrate just how vital US ammunition is, not only for the front lines, but also for striking behind them effectively. Here we see a Panzer S-1 system of the Russian army, which is a system that, among other things, fires anti-aircraft missiles. It was hit and destroyed in the Luhansk region at the end of February 2025. Interestingly, we're seeing the footage this time from a Russian perspective, and we can focus and see how indiscriminate, uncontrolled missiles are moving in all directions. Here we see it. One of the missiles flies upwards directly from this tank system, because the entire system has obviously exploded, and we also see that in other directions along the ground, missiles are moving very uncontrollably. The Russians filming this, becoming more and more something between brave and reckless, that's for sure. They're filming this up close, now pulling back from this vehicle, and these are the images of the night. That is this S-1 tank system on that night, and this supposedly was taken the very next day. That means yet another system of the Russian army, worth around 12 million euros, was destroyed here. Why? Because on one hand, they had the information either from Ukrainian drones or American intelligence about where this system was located, and of course they also had the American ammunition. In this case, probably from HIMARS, so it's been said, with a range of 85 kilometers to attack this unit and destroy this Panzer S-1 system. Of course, this is just one system among many, but after 3 years of war, the Russians don't have many of these modern Panzer S-1 systems left. But nevertheless, this system could have, of course, intercepted Ukrainian long-range drones on their way to Moscow and therefore absolutely had to be destroyed. Let's take a look at another video from the Ukrainian army, specifically a video of an entirely new and modern kamikaze drone in use, a fixed-wing aircraft, so a drone, not a quadcopter like we just saw, but relatively large. Here we see the drone approaching Vasilivka, a small village located far behind the front lines, over 20 kilometers away, which was captured by the Russian forces in 2014. And now we see the different perspectives of this drone, and we can truly observe the high-tech equipment being used here. The complete setup, a drone, it's called UAS Seth. That's its name. It's being deployed for the very first time here and now. We can see it on the right with the 12th Special Forces Brigade Azov of the Ukrainian National Guard. And this drone, as we can see here, is equipped with a lot of electronics. I wouldn't necessarily call it AI, but certainly software that performs a comparison between the target being aimed at and the wind conditions, the current trajectory, and so on. And we can see here, both from this perspective and up here, that the target is being engaged, that it's not just the operator, but the drone itself with its software is capable of making the adjustments to effectively engage the target. And this entire process involves cutting-edge technology that's being utilized here. Specifically, Ukrainian high-tech, key point, so not foreign, and now we'll see the approach from the left. Let's see if we can spot it. Focus on this black dot here. It's now flying toward a truck with electronic warfare equipment belonging to the Russian army. We can see it here from both perspectives. Top left, just focus for a moment. That's the Ural truck with the electronic warfare system on top. And here we see it once again. And we can see that the drone on one hand is of course way too fast for a human to still be able to control it, but it is also capable of attacking this truck with pinpoint accuracy. In the end, we see a slight pull to the left, likely explodes nearby. Still, it has significant power, and that's why we'll also see from another perspective that a significant amount of destruction is definitely caused here. Here again, the two perspectives. So here's one vehicle, followed by a second vehicle, and here you can clearly see the windshield. At the end, it goes a bit to the left. Nonetheless, we see the explosion happens right next to the vehicle there. The Ukrainians are currently remaining very silent about the range and payload, as well as the explosive impact of the drone. Nonetheless, this is definitely a new vehicle intended to help Ukraine, not in the realm of quadcopters, but in the domain of fixed-wing aircraft, to strike precisely deep behind the front lines. And not only with human skill, which of course remains essential, but also with a significantly enhanced level of automation. That's what they reveal. The drone can be operated by almost anyone. Once you tell it where to fly, it's capable of making course corrections on its own to precisely hit the target. Finally, we want to take a look at acknowledgements. Acknowledgements from the Ukrainian army expressing gratitude for the assistance provided by the Americans. And who knows, perhaps that also played a role in the agreement reached in Jeddah yesterday to resume military aid. Let's check that. Donald Trump and JD claimed it. Vance's assertion that Ukrainians don't say thank you enough is completely false. President Zelensky had already thanked Donald Trump 15 times before for the military aid in various tweets and so on. Nevertheless, the claim was made, and the Ukrainians are now reacting to it. Here we see a Max Pro of the Ukrainian army for the first time, and we can clearly see how the Ukrainians are expressing their gratitude. Thank you, USA. Thanks for helping us, for standing by us in the fight against Russia's aggression. Here we see various vehicles, different artillery systems that are being deployed. Let's take a look. I think that's an M777 that was deployed here. But what's also interesting, as we look at the posters, we don't see anyone thanking Donald Trump, but rather thanking the American people and the US for their support. The whole thing was deliberately done in English to make it clear, we, Ukraine, are thanking you, the United States, and less so Donald Trump, for the support you have provided us since 2022. And it is absolutely not the case that there is any kind of ingratitude here or an assumption of entitlement on the part of Ukraine. But rather it is that Ukraine is fully aware that without US assistance, we've just seen, I believe, an M2 Browning, and now we're looking at a Humvee. The Ukrainians are absolutely aware of this, that without US aid, they would have lost this war against Russia a long time ago. Thus, yet another myth propagated by Trump and co., that the Ukrainians are ungrateful, was debunked once again by numerous units of the Ukrainian army.